Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Virginia Trioli and we're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight. Joining me on the panel, Year 11 student Arth Tuteja, paediatrician and child health researcher Dr. Anthea Rhodes, epidemiologist and paediatrician Professor Fiona Russell, and in Sydney Year 12 student Petria Houvardas. And you'll know him from Coronacast. He's also on the board of the Research Alliance for Children and Youth, Dr. Swan. And it's great to have you all here. Good evening. Thanks for being here.
Hi, my name's Lucia and I'm 7 years old. I just wanted to know why my mum and dad are getting the vaccine and me and my little sister are not.
One of the biggest questions you can possibly be asked right now. Fiona, we'll start with you. Why is little Lucia not getting the vaccine?
Lucia, what a fantastic question that you've asked tonight, and thank you for your question. Now, what happens with kids is that, by and large, this disease, this infection, coronavirus or COVID, is very mild by and large in kids your age, and most of them don't get very sick. But unlike your parents and your grandparents and doctors and nurses, they can get very sick and end up in hospital, and so it's really important that they get vaccinated first and then afterwards, because otherwise if they do get sick, there's no one to look after you. So it's really important that they get vaccinated so they don't get sick, and then once later this year, probably maybe next year, then children about your age, under 12 years old, may be able to get vaccinated too. But there's not a vaccine that's available and being tested in little kids under 12 just yet that's been tested and ready to go. But maybe next year that'll be something for you, Louisa.
Anthea, is that still the right focus? Of course, it's being tested at the moment, and we could get to, maybe Swan can speak to us about the trials that are going on for the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines overseas in very, very young children. Yeah. Is it still the right focus that very young kids don't need it?
Well, at this stage, we can't offer a vaccine to a young child until it's adequately tested. It's been through all the appropriate processes to know that it's safe enough and effective enough for children of that age group to have. So we're simply not there yet, actually, Virginia, when it comes to children in the age group that we've just seen. Obviously, the conversation for children who are a bit older is different. When we're looking at children over 12 and up through to 16, then we know we have something that is safe and effective for that age group, and really that's come to the forefront of discussion now. The question is, should they be prioritised?
Petria, what do you think of the question there by Lucia?
I mean, it's a really heartbreaking question. Obviously, she wants to be able to go out, play with her friends and have a normal childhood, and she's deprived of that because she can't get the vaccine. And obviously we definitely have to prioritise adults to make sure that they can look after children, because if they can't, then we have a very, very large problem where the pandemic spreads exponentially and everyone is affected by the disease. So I think that definitely we need to prioritise adults, but I think we need to also look at children and how they can possibly live in the world, because, you know, their struggles are immense as well, and them living in a normal society is very important.
Arth, have you heard similar questions from either siblings or siblings of friends of yours?
Absolutely, Virginia, and we all want the vaccine, right? And it's really a shame that we haven't gotten to a point where there has been one that has been approved for that age group, and it's diminishing a lot of young people's childhoods. In Melbourne and Sydney, half the country is locked down, and you know, they're not experiencing preschool, early childhood education the way they should be. I've missed out now on 200 days of my schooling, and I'm sure, Petria, now you're going into your third month of lockdown. We as young people, we want to contribute to getting our education and to contribute to our society. So we also need to be brought into the consideration when it comes to, you know, who's getting the vaccine. Absolutely.
Norman, how are those trials going? Have you got any oversight on them, the ones for much younger kids?
Well, just to say there's two trials going on. Moderna's starting one and Pfizer's doing one. Pfizer's been told to go back and recruit more children because they want to be really sure that it's safe and effective. We're in an odd situation, and it's a really good question. I agree with Fiona, is that most vaccines start in childhood. So this is turned on its head. Almost every vaccine you can think of was developed for children and young people. But this is one that's been developed for adults because adults got hit hard quickly, and children for children, we're playing a bit of catch up. But as Anthea said, maybe by the end of this year, beginning of the next year, we will have a vaccine which will be safe and effective for kids. But this is a pandemic, and we've been constantly playing catch up around the world.
Do we have a sense of timing with those trials? Is there any sense of when they might come to an end?
They're saying with the Pfizer one towards November, something like that, but you just never know because they could have a glitch in the trial, something goes wrong with the trial, you just don't know.
Fiona, are there any early indicators that it might be the wrong path to use these kind of vaccines with very young children?
Yeah, look, safety is an absolute paramount concern, is number one concern with the clinical trials. And so as any vaccine is developed, we always start with adults first, just a small number of adults, and then we go down through the ages. And that's for actually the infant vaccines as well. We don't start straight with the babies. So that's just a normal process with vaccine development anyway. And also what we've found is that when you do vaccinate people about your age, Arth, is that your responses to the vaccine is much better than adults. And so younger children have actually, they've had to tinker with the dosages and get a smaller dose. And so it's not the same vaccine, it's actually a smaller dose. So they have to titrate it. And then even littler kids, again, they titrate it again. So they have to really do the studies to make sure it's safe and it works.
Mm-hmm. We're just going to do a series of quick fire questions now, getting some straight answers from our experts here. And we'll start with Sophia McPherson.
Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm 10 years old and I attend Radford College ACT. I'm worried about the side effects of the COVID-19 vaccines for kids under the age of 12. Will the side effects be different for kids than adults?
Thank you, Sophia. We'll turn that one to Fiona. Fiona, will the side effects on the vaccine be different for the younger ones?
Yes, so we don't know yet, possibly, and that's why we're doing the study. So really important to do specific studies, as I've mentioned before, in particular age groups, because they might be different. As we've found out with the Pfizer vaccine in young people, there's particular side effect in that, and it's just for sort of young people. And so with under 12s as well, that's why we're tinkering with the doses. We have to very safely and carefully have a look at that. But the common side effects, I would imagine, but we don't know yet, will be a sore arm, a fever, feeling a bit under the weather for a day or two, but by and large bounce back and come back to normal with a bit of Panadol. So that's what we would expect.
OK, our next question now comes from Indy Hall.
What happens to our body if we catch COVID?
Beautifully asked too, can I just say. Norman, we'll give that one to you. What happens to our bodies?
Hi, Indy. Well, the virus goes in through your nose and you breathe it in and it goes into your chest and it goes through the lining, like the inside of your mouth. It goes inside that and it multiplies because the virus is pretty nasty and all the virus wants to do is find somebody else to infect. So more virus is produced and you cough it out. So it irritates you and you cough. And that coughing allows the virus to pass to other people. Now, in little kids, that's all that happens. You might get a runny nose and a cough and maybe a fever because the army inside your body that fights the virus, the immune system, works very hard and makes you hot. And that's probably all that happens. And a lot of kids, they don't know they've got it. They get nothing at all. And it's only a very small number of kids, tiny, tiny number of kids who get sick enough to need to be in hospital. So imagine I don't know how many kids are in your primary school class. Let's say there's 30. If you've got 3 classes like you and they all get infected with COVID, only one might be sick enough to be in hospital. And even then they'll do okay. So it's a really mild disease in your age group. So it's not something to stay up at night worrying about.
OK, our next question now comes from Amaya George.
I'm Amaya George, 7-year-old, and I live in the ACT. The lockdown was so sudden and I'm really worried what's going to happen next and how long are we going to live like this? Are we going to die?
Anthea, we're going to give you the "Are we going to die?" question.
Maya, it sounds like you've got some really big worries. And the first thing I want to say is that you're not going to be alone thinking about big worries like that. And when change happens really quickly, it's normal to feel worried. Even some grown-ups are worried about things at the moment. But it's really important that you know that you're not going to die. So here in Australia, no children at all have died from COVID since the beginning of the pandemic. And even all over the world, very, very few children have died or even got very sick from COVID. The other thing that you talked about was what's going to happen next. And that's a really hard thing to think about when so much is changing. And it's important that we tell you we don't exactly know, but we do know that things might be like this for a little while in the lockdown. It might be a few days, it might be a few weeks, but it won't be forever. And if you keep talking to mum and dad about what's happening, then they can keep you up to date on when things are going to change.
I'd like to ask Arth and Petria what advice they might give as well to our very worried young questioner there. Petria?
I would just like to say we're definitely, you know, in a really lucky state where we live in a great country with amazing medical facilities. And so that's a really, really amazing thing where we know that if we do get COVID, we'll have people to look after us. But I think this speaks to the general disillusionment that young people and children are facing. We're living in this age where this is a crazy, unprecedented time, and these anxiety-ridden thoughts are consuming us. And we don't really hear much information about how to overcome that. And it just shows the mental impact on young people. And I think we need to prioritise that and figure out a way to combat that so that young people can attempt to live a life where it isn't filled with these sort of like very extreme thoughts. It's very sad, yeah.
Arth?
Amaya, I think you're so young, and, you know, we love the fact that, you know, our young people usually separate themselves from what's going on in current affairs, and they're happier than us because of that. So can you, for all of us, don't worry about this. Mum and Dad will take care of it for you. Stay happy, keep smiling, eat some lollies, and, you know, do your online classes. Go for walks, look at the sun, and be thankful that we're in a country with, you know, a strategy like suppression or aggressive suppression like Australia, and we're not in a situation like India was in, or a situation like the US currently is in.
I support all of that, right up to and including the lollies. And I'll simply say a bit of moderation there.
I've asked this question to my parents a number of times with no clear answer, but when will COVID end? And when will life go back to normal?
Yes, it's the question we're all asking ourselves. Norman, we'll go to you on that.
Well, Finn, my sympathies with your parents, because nobody can answer that question. COVID will never end. The virus is with us for the rest of our lives. It's not going to disappear. It'll change as time goes on. So what's going to happen is that we'll get immunised, and when enough of us are immunised, probably 95% of us are immunised, then very few people are going to get sick with this virus, and life will go back to some semblance of normality. And then what happens is we'll learn to live with this virus and not get anxious about it, and it'll be like a bit like influenza, where it comes and goes each year. And maybe one year we've got a bad year of COVID, and one year we've got a good year, and every year you're probably going to have a jab with both COVID and flu to keep you topped up with your immunity. And that's the way it's going to be. We won't be wearing masks forever, but we will for some time to come into 2022. But in early 2022, we should be able to travel both within Australia and internationally.
Anthea, I know that you believe that we've really got to move quickly now on adjusting our thinking away from COVID zero and donut days. So is that the version of normality we need to start talking about?
Well, I think, Virginia, we have to look at the situation as it is continually as we go through the pandemic and understand what's changing and what we're going to do next. So you've talked about, do we look to a different plan? And I think that's something that definitely is being talked about here in Australia now. We've heard some dialogue about it. Because if we look to the world globally and we look at the Northern Hemisphere, who are travelling a season or so ahead of us, we haven't seen a successful example of elimination as a longer-term solution. There are absolutely benefits and harm minimisation as a result of having aggressively suppressed the virus, and we have saved a lot of lives without a doubt here in Australia having done this up until this point. But we have to keep re-evaluating. This is the challenge. Everything moves as soon as a decision is made or a plan is set or a model is built. Some of the game changes, and that's been the challenge for our leaders. So at this point now, we still have to look forward and say, do we have to pivot towards a way through?
Can I just add to that? Because we've heard a lot of distress from Arth and Petria and the children about the anxiety and frustration and with the schooling and the fear of going back to school, which is is really heartbreaking to sort of hear that distress. And so what we really need to hear, and I'm speaking here as a parent and as a wife of a teacher, that we really need to have a plan that we can hear from our leaders in terms of their plan for schools and to alleviate this distress, because a lot of the usual things that we have in our lives to make us feel better have been taken away. And for children and for teenagers, that is school. And what has been really clear in this pandemic is that schools do more than just educate children. They do, there's so much more for mental health, for their social development, for feeling positive about and having a life. And their life to some degree has become their bedroom and their device. And that is not a life, and it's not a life for a child. And in Victoria, that's been particularly awful and very distressing to hear many stories of what's been going on in that regard. And for some children, school is the safest place. And so I want to reassure children and parents that are listening that this isn't, what we are living in now is not typical for the rest of the world. Europe has had their schools open since March, and they have plans in place, and they haven't been vaccinating their children or their teenagers until very recently.
I want to jump in there because I know that you came up with what you saw as a traffic light system to get schools reopened on the basis of threat and the basis of the infection in society, which wasn't taken up. And it's been something that's really mattered to you. You think we've been too aggressive with our suppression strategy, if I can phrase it that way, at the expense of kids in school?
Look, absolutely. I think there's no doubt about it. And what we know from international data is that schools are not the hotbed of infection. Children are more likely to get infected in their house or out shopping than in the school. I mean, the British data, the UK data is very clear on that, and that is with Delta as well.
I just want to hear from Norman Swan on this, because it gets us really to a discussion about the modelling that we are now relying on that comes from the Doherty Institute. Norman?
So the Delta's changed it a bit. So you're now seeing a surge in Britain, and it's just after schools have gone back in Scotland, and you're seeing a surge that's associated with schools going back. And I understand what you're saying. It's either the kids kind of caught it at home and they're bringing it into school, but kids are transmitting, and they're transmitting in the United States as well. So that's where the modelling goes a bit off. Look, what I want to say, which I think is more positive for schools, is that we could be using technology better to open schools really quite soon, using things by getting ventilation better. Our schools are not designed, our kids breathe dirty air. We all breathe dirty air in the environment in which we live. We haven't thought about this. But can we open windows? Can we put in fans? Can we have highly ventilated environments, wearing masks, vaccinated teachers, rapid antigen testing, maybe even for kids and teachers, so that if you're positive, if infectious, you don't come to school. There are ways of actually getting back to school which are, which use technology to make it a much safer place.
Absolutely, and people like Orla Hegarty have done amazing work in Ireland, and other leading scientists who work with aerosols who have been advocating for this for absolute months. Ventilation, filtration, masking, separation and the like. Anthea, none of that has been picked up and has been taken up. None of that's been worked into the programs that we're looking at to reopen, to open schools safely again, to get kids back. Is that frustrating to you and to the place like the Children's Hospital that it's not been put front and centre?
I think it's time for it to be put front and centre, Virginia. I will absolutely say that. We've talked a lot today about vaccination, and obviously that is one enormous tool in the toolkit to help make school a safe place for children, vaccination of children when it's ready for them in the younger age groups, and for those older kids, as we've talked about today, as soon as it can happen, really. But it doesn't sort of stop and start and finish there. There's vaccinating everyone around the child, which we've just heard about from Norman. There's all the other things that can happen in schools around masks, around ventilation. And we're hearing from our leaders that schools won't stay shut one day longer than they have to. So the minute we're ready to open, the kids will be there. Well, we need to be ready for that to be a safe experience, and that is going to take time, and it needs to start now.
Yeah, but they say that, but they don't plan for it.
Correct.
There's no planning for it. It's, using my phrase again, it's clod hopping, where we've got this programmatic inefficiency and slowness, and they all talk, but there's no action.
There's one thing that I did want to raise, though, and we've sort of touched on it, which is the fact that children, as yet, and it's a great thing, are not getting seriously ill from the disease. Can I just bring in a little bit of a caution and a caveat, I guess? I remember being told this right back at the beginning of the pandemic last year. Oh, children don't catch it, they won't catch it. Oh, and they won't pass it on. And gosh, it turned out that they could. We don't actually know yet. There are high numbers of children getting infected with the disease overseas, particularly in the United States, about 200 hospitalisations a day there at the moment. We don't know yet, Fiona, long term, whether, even if they catch it and it's only mild, as Norman says, whether down the track that might not be a serious thing.
Yes. Well, just a couple of things. Just going back to what Norman was saying about the infections in schools in the UK, they did 6 surveys every month, and they found that in the Delta in June, in the survey of schools where they looked at thousands of children, thousands of teachers, thousands of secondary school students, they found that less than 0.4% were positive. And so we have to get this in perspective, because we hear about every outbreak in a school and we think, oh my goodness, every child in the school has been infected. That is actually not the case. It might be one outbreak in the school, but there might only be half a dozen of kids. So that's one issue to just sort of talk about. In terms of the long-term effects...
Just quickly.
Yeah. So in terms of long COVID, when we think about long COVID, this is persistence of symptoms. It's very different in children than adults. In adults, it sounds like, it is very serious and there's multi-organ damage and horrible things. But in children, because their immune systems are so different, when we talk about long COVID in children, it's things like fatigue, feeling anxious, loss of taste, and things like that, and a sore throat.
That's still stuff you'd like to avoid in a child, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Arthur's nodding here.
Yes, but Virginia, when we get it in perspective, this happens to other viruses as well. It's not just COVID, you see. There's other viruses. And when we look at common viruses that paediatricians really are busy about, and Anthea, you can tell us even more, there's 6,000 admissions every year from RSV, the respiratory syncytial virus, and that is what really worries paediatricians.
We do have to keep COVID in context. It's not to say that any harm isn't something we want to avoid for children. Absolutely it is. But we, as people out in the community, we haven't heard about all the other things that make kids sick and that kids get injured from and turn up in hospital for regularly. So we need to think about it in the context of that.
Hi, I'm Lachlan, a uni student who moved down to Melbourne from Brisbane in July to study in person on campus for the very first time in my degree. It was all going to be very exciting, and then it all fell apart very quickly thanks to those 2 COVID lockdowns we've had. Now I've been living alone for 2 months, don't know a single person in the entire state, and I work from home too, so this is the closest I've gotten to being outside in quite a while. My question is to Dr. Rhodes, because you've written about the subject and I'm very morbidly curious. What impact do you think this isolation is having on my mental state and that of all of the other young people who might be in the same boat as me right now?
I feel everyone in Melbourne and Victoria has to apologise to Lachlan this evening for it. But Anthea, tell us about the research you've done.
Look, Lachlan, thanks for your question. And absolutely, we've looked through the National Child Health Poll at how experiences of the pandemic generally, and we have to understand that it's not just lockdown, but also lockdown and for school kids, remote learning, have impacted on their mental health and well-being. And you are not alone at feeling a bit despondent and like it might be affecting your mood and your energy. So over a third of Australian kids have had a negative impact on their mental health as a result of the pandemic, and that's been more notable in areas where there's been longer lockdowns. So Victoria at the front there, and closely behind now, New South Wales. So I think there's a lot of evidence to tell us that these experiences do affect the mental health of young people, and that's another reason why we can't be really reductive when we think about how we're minimising harms when it comes to COVID. It's not just about the virus and the virus numbers. They are incredibly important, but there are other harms happening too. So not being able to go out into the community is not a neutral experience. It's an experience that comes with its own trade-offs, and they have to be considered in the equation continually as we go forward making policy decisions about how we best manage this.
Arth, did you want to jump in there?
I think what's really important to remember as well, and I go back to this point again, is it's really challenging, especially in Victoria. They're called short snap lockdowns, the Premier calls them.
But they really are.
They really, I mean, we're looking at 6 weeks on this one, Virginia, at the minimum. And, you know, to go in and out every time is incredibly challenging. The effects, and Petria, you know, the 2-month-long one especially, it's so disheartening. And when you have family members overseas, I haven't seen my family in India since 2016. I've lost multiple family members in the process. And it's so, and then you're taking the burden sometimes of your parents as well, because you're with them, you're not escaping that. So you've got all this stress on your head, and it feels sometimes as if, you know, the government doesn't recognise that, particularly in terms of our education. I mean, there has been no comment so far from the Victorian Curriculum Authority as to, you know, should there not be an extension of when we have to sit our exams? How on earth can they expect us to be prepared to start in October? And I'm, you know, Fiona, you've got a son in year 11. I'm sure he has the same concerns about the 3-4 subject he's doing this year.
We'll hear from Fiona in a second. I want to hear from Petria now. Petria, go ahead.
Well, I guess that's very accurate. I thought for the Year 12 students in Victoria at the moment, they've had over 200 days. I can't even imagine that. I've had over 2 months, and the general consensus from what I'm hearing from Year 12 students, from Year 11 students, is the lack of motivation and how they don't know how they'll be able to sit an exam in a couple months' time and do their best, which is a really challenging aspect because, yes, we can all sit our HSC or our VCE, but will that be a true reflection of our intelligence, of our hard work that we put in over the past 2 years? Because our demeanour has shifted. Our work ethic has shifted. We are, you know, we don't know what's going to happen. So there hasn't been this, you know, this grind to go and keep working and, you know, push forward. And instead we're left with, you know, what will happen is the HSC already has inequity in many ways, but COVID and lockdowns have impacted different socioeconomic groups dramatically. Some people, you know, teenagers don't even have access to Wi-Fi, to a laptop. How are we going to go and sit an exam when there's disparity between all areas of Sydney, between all areas of Melbourne, and then, you know, expect that everything's normal? Because the fact is, this situation isn't normal. It's very, very hard for young people, and we don't know what's going to happen and how inequity is going to be dealt with, and so that everyone gets a fair outcome.
I want to go to you, Fiona, because the question needs to be asked at some point, and there are those who are part of the so-called shadow pandemic movement who are talking about the shadow pandemic of mental health that's associated this, wondering whether the right call was made to put a higher priority on older people and protect them over at the expense of younger people. It's dreadful that it's even considered a binary, and I reject that whole idea that it's a binary choice between the two anyway, but that sort of seems to be to those who are trying to support the rights of children and what children have lost out of the pandemic, the way that they're seeing it. Do you want to reflect on that for a moment?
Look, there is absolutely no doubt, Virginia, that the rights of children have been pushed aside for adults. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that. Children have not had voice. Children have not even been, you know, considered, as we've heard tonight. It's only really in the last 2 weeks, I would say, where children have been visible, by and large, in this pandemic. And it's absolutely well overdue that children are put central, as we've heard, because this, you know, as in climate change, I mean, children are our future. We know that education is more than just, you know, going and sitting tests. It's more about social development. It's more about children to learn and grow, and teenagers need other children. You know, little kids need to learn how to share, they need to learn those social skills, and they learn that by interacting. And then for teenagers, it's learning about your identity, it's the peer support, it's all and who you are, and it's interacting. So there is no doubt children's rights have been pushed aside.
Anthea?
It does feel like when we reflect and recognising that it's all easy in hindsight, and this has moved very quickly, and a lot of decisions have had to be made, as we keep moving and the game changes. But that said, it feels like at the beginning there was a lot of relief that children didn't get sick. We were worried about our kids, and we all exhaled and went, oh, thank goodness, kids don't get sick. And it was a bit like that was the end. Oh, thank goodness, kids don't get sick, the end. And the role the kids had then, and many of the sacrifices that, our young people are telling us about today, were made to protect older people. And now we're changing our story because we see that kids might be getting sick. Fortunately, they still don't seem to be getting very sick very often from COVID, even with Delta.
But the mental health cost has been high.
Correct, but we're seeing other ways that they've been impacted, and it's incredibly important that we don't continue with that. We're at a point now where we could look and say, what do our children need? What will this look like if we put them at the centre? For starters, we would be vaccinating everyone around children as a priority. Healthcare workers, yes, incredibly important. I'm one myself. But what about the teachers? What about the childcare workers? These people surround our children. They would be Category 1B if we put the children first.
We have a final question coming for you, but I just want to mention that if this discussion has raised any issues for you or anyone you know and care for, remember you can get help from Lifeline or from the Kids Helpline, and the numbers are on your screen now. That's all the time that we have for, so please thank our marvellous panel, Arth Tuteja, Anthea Rhodes, Fiona Russell, Petria Houvardas and Norman Swan. And thank you, of course, for sharing all your brilliant questions this evening. Next week, David Spears will be here on the Big Red Dot for a look at the National Summit for Women's Safety. There's been plenty of talk about that, but are we really doing enough to keep women safe? On the panel will be Australian of the Year Grace Tame, Federal Police Commissioner Reece Kershaw and Shadow Foreign Minister Penny Wong. And you can join me tomorrow morning on ABC Radio Melbourne. Stay safe, good night and go well.